Alara crossed the battlefield with a wooden bucket in her hands, and the smoke still clawing at the sky stung the back of her throat with every step. Hundreds of soldiers had watched men die for coming too close to Varkan after a fight, yet she walked toward the blood-soaked beast as if no one had told her the rule at all. Maybe no one had. She had spent the war carrying water to the wounded, not learning which names were forbidden to approach. At the center of the ruined field, Varkan stood taller than any wolf that had ever crossed her path, his black fur dark and wet. His golden eyes narrowed with something closer to judgment than pain. Soldiers shouted for her to stop. A bowstring creaked somewhere behind her. Even the man in the black cloak standing near the tree line did not move toward his own beast, though everyone there answered to him. Alara did not know his name yet. She only knew that a king who let his soldiers die rather than risk his hand near that blood was not a king she owed her fear. She knelt in the mud without looking Varkan in the eyes the way she would kneel beside any frightened animal. "I did not come to control you," she said. "I only do not want you to suffer alone." The growl that answered her shook the ground under her knees, and for one breath she believed she had made a mistake she would not live to correct, unaware that the beast was about to choose her, and that the choosing would not end with him. The man in the black cloak was Cassian, and 7 years earlier he had ruled Arendor as its alpha king. He owned nothing of that now, no crown, no palace, no army that answered without hesitation. What remained of his kingdom was a handful of loyal warriors, a stretch of forest to hide in, and Varkan, the ancient beast that had served his bloodline for generations and had just refused his hand in front of every soldier who still called him lord. Most of Arendor believed Cassian had died the night the throne fell. It was easier for people to mourn a dead king than to ask why a living one had let his kingdom slip through his fingers. The truth was crueler than either version. His crown had not been taken by an invading army. It had been dismantled from the inside by clan leaders, noble houses, generals, and advisors who had once knelt beside his throne and sworn their names to it. The man who led that unmaking was Vaelor, Cassian's former beta, and the closest thing he had ever had to a brother. They had trained together, bled together, buried soldiers together. Vaelor believed Cassian's mercy was a weakness dressed up as virtue, that a king who refused to rule every clan through fear would eventually be ruled by someone who did not share his hesitation. He had proven himself right by allying with the Regency Council, hiring mercenary companies, and turning half the nobility against the throne in a single season. Cassian watched Alara work the blood from Varkan's fur, and felt the old ache of everything he had lost rise in his chest, but he had not lost it innocently, and some part of him had always known that. Before the coup, he had believed loyalty was owed to him simply because he wore the crown. He had trusted the weight of his bloodline more than he had ever trusted a man's actual conduct. He had treated Varkan as a banner to be raised before battle, rather than a creature capable of pain, and he had walked past servants, villagers, and low-ranking soldiers 100 times without learning a single one of their names, certain that a crowned king did not need to. Varkan had refused him after the battle. The beast had lowered his head for a girl with no title and no weapon instead. The rejection cut deeper than Cassian wanted to admit, deeper than the loss of the throne itself, because a crown could be stolen by better men with better armies, but a creature's trust could only be lost through the person you had actually been. "Why did you go to him?" Cassian asked, stepping close enough that Alara had to look up. He did not soften the question. He had stopped softening anything years ago. Alara did not rise, and she did not bow. "Everyone else saw a monster," she said, wringing the cloth over the bucket until the water ran pink. "I saw a creature that fought for people who were too afraid to wash the blood off him afterward." Cassian said nothing for a long moment. He understood with the kind of clarity that came too late to be useful that she was not only speaking about Varkan. He and the beast had both been raised up when they were needed, and left to carry their wounds alone once the war moved past them. Alara had not meant the words as an accusation. She had simply seen pain that everyone else had mistaken for rage, the way she had learned to see it in wounded men who snapped at the hands trying to help them. She did not know why the sentence had come so easily to her, only that it had felt true the moment she said it. That night, away from the firelight, she washed the blood from her own hands in a basin of cold water and found a mark, glowing faintly silver, across her palm. It had not been there that morning. She turned her hand toward the little light left in the camp, and the mark pulsed once, like something answering a question she had not asked. She pressed her other hand over it immediately, heart hammering, and wrapped a strip of torn cloth around her palm before anyone could see. If the soldiers found it, they would call her a witch, or worse, a spy sent to work some curse into their camp. She had survived this war by staying unremarkable. She intended to keep surviving it the same way. She did not see the old man watching her from beyond the firelight, half hidden by a fallen banner pole. His name was Malgrim, once an advisor to Cassian's father, long assumed dead since the night the palace gates opened to Vialor's men. He had spent 7 years disappearing into the forgotten corners of the kingdom, and he had not expected on an ordinary evening beside a battlefield to see a mark he had believed erased from the world, along with the family that once carried it. Impossible, he murmured to himself, low enough that even the wind nearly took the word before it left him. The bloodline of the Keepers of the Oath did not die. He said nothing more that night. He only watched the girl retreat into her tent, and he began quietly to remember things he had spent 7 years trying to forget. Far from the battlefield in the capital, Vaelor now ruled through the Regency Council. None of this had reached him yet. His grip on Arindor did not rest on love, and he had never pretended otherwise. It rested on tribute collected from villages that could not afford it, on sons taken from their families to fill the ranks of an army that grew larger every season, and on the simple, well-enforced rule that no one spoke Cassian's name above a whisper. Those who forgot that rule were made into examples quickly enough that the lesson rarely needed repeating twice in the same district. Vaelor's ambition had never been the throne alone. He wanted more than the crown itself, to prove something he had believed since they were young men training in the same yard, that fear built a sturdier kingdom than love ever could, and that Cassian's gentler instincts had always been the weakness that would eventually cost him everything. Every tax collected, every son conscripted, every silence bought with punishment was in Vaelor's mind further proof that he had been right, and Cassian had been a fool wearing a crown he did not have the stomach to keep. Alara knew nothing of Vaelor's reasoning, and less of the prophecy her own bloodline had once guarded. She only knew that her palm ached faintly beneath the cloth wrapped around it, and that somewhere, past the tree line, an old man she had never spoken to was staring at her tent as though he had seen a ghost wearing her face. She had come to this camp to survive the war, one day at a time. She had no way of knowing yet that washing the blood from a beast no one else would touch had already begun to crack a throne built 400 miles away. The story of a beast bowing to a servant girl was never going to stay contained to one battlefield. Soldiers carried it into border towns. Border towns carried it into markets. By the time it reached the capital, it had stopped being a rumor and had become something closer to a declaration whispered in taverns where men still remembered the old crown the beast of the first king had bowed to a girl who wore no crown at all. Vaelor heard the words with a stillness that unsettled the whole Regency Council. He knew the old prophecy, the one the royal family had spent generations pretending did not exist, that when the blood of war was washed from the keeper of the throne by a hand seeking no power, the false crown would begin to crack. He brought his fist down on the council table, hard enough to silence the room. "Bring the girl to me alive," he said. "Kill Cassian. Bind the beast in silver. Burn every record of that prophecy you can find." If Varkon had truly accepted someone outside the bloodline, then everything Vaelor had built could no longer be defended as anything but theft, and he intended to bury that truth before it reached further than the border camps. Word of the order did not need to travel far to reach Cassian, and he responded the only way 7 years of exile had taught him to respond to danger, by trying to make it disappear quietly. He ordered Alara move deeper into camp, away from open ground, away from anyone who might be watching. Alara refused to be handled like a piece of luggage. "Why did Varkon choose me?" she asked, standing her ground in front of the tent Cassian wanted her hidden inside. "What does this mark mean? Why would washing blood off an animal threaten a kingdom 400 miles away? Are you protecting me, Cassian? Or do you mean to use me to take your throne back?" He had no answer that satisfied either of them. For the first time since the coup, he was facing someone who did not extend him trust simply because he had once worn a crown, and the absence of that easy trust unsettled him more than an army at the gate would have. The attack came that night. Men slipped into camp dressed as wounded soldiers, bandaged and limping, until they were close enough to move fast. One went for Alara's tent. Another cut the rope holding Varkan's healing enclosure, not to free him kindly, but to loose him into chaos. Two men seized Alara by the arms. Before she had finished reaching for the blade she kept under her bedroll, dragging her toward the tree line with a knife pressed flat against her throat. Varkan tore free of the cut rope and crossed the camp faster than anyone could raise a weapon against him. Soldiers scattered. He struck the first assassin down before the man finished turning and pinned the second beneath one massive paw, the red judgment already climbing into his golden eyes. Alara reached him before Cassian could. She pressed her palm, the marked one, still wrapped in cloth, against the side of his neck. "Enough," she said. Varkan stopped. The whole camp stopped with him, soldiers frozen mid-motion, Cassian frozen at the edge of the firelight, watching a girl with no title, calm a fury that he himself had never once been able to reach. Her hands did not stop shaking until long after the soldiers had dragged the bodies away. She had felt the knife's edge against her own throat only moments before, close enough that she had already begun composing the last thing she meant to say, if it came to that, and no one asked her whether she was unhurt. They asked instead how she had stopped him, as though the answer might be a trick they could learn and use themselves. She did not have an answer that satisfied them. She barely had one that satisfied her. The last assassin lived long enough to be unmasked. Blood filled his mouth as Cassian tore the cloth free from his face, and what he found beneath it was worse than a stranger, a man who had once served under his own command before the coup, before all of it. Sewn into the lining of his cloak was Vaelor's mark. In his fist, an order written in blood: "Bring the girl, the beast will follow." Cassian understood then what Vaelor actually wanted, not Alara's death, her leash. She was not a threat to be removed. She was a key, and Vaelor intended to turn that key himself. Alara looked at him across the ruined camp, still breathing hard, still holding the cloth over her palm like a wound she had to keep closed by hand. "You said you would protect me," she said. "Then I will begin by telling you the truth," Cassian answered. "I do not know why he chose you. I only know that Vaelor is afraid enough of the answer to send men to die for it." It was the first honest thing he had said to her since the battlefield, and it cost him more than he expected to admit that a fallen king did not have every answer his crown once implied he should. They left before sunrise. Cassian, Alara, Varkan, and the handful of soldiers still loyal enough to follow a man with no throne moving toward Ravenshade, the old stronghold where rumor said warriors who never broke their oath had gone to ground 7 years earlier. Alara agreed to the journey for one reason only. She wanted the truth about the mark, about Varkan, about the power that now seemed to be hunting her by name. The road did not spare her the cost of that truth. They crossed villages stripped bare by Regency tax collectors, forests patrolled by mercenaries who worked for whoever paid fastest, and settlements where the wolf clans no longer trusted any banner, old or new. Alara watched families hide grain beneath their floorboards before soldiers arrived. She watched mothers stand in doorways while their sons were taken for an army that fed on them and gave nothing back. In more than one burned house, she saw warnings scratched into the wood against speaking Cassian's name aloud. No one greeted him as a returning king. Most of the kingdom had learned at great cost that every crown eventually asked for blood from the people beneath it, and Cassian's absence for 7 years had done nothing to convince anyone he would be different. Alara walked beside the horses more often than she rode, and the closer they came to the heart of the ruined countryside, the less she recognized the man beside her as the same one who had once demanded to know why she had approached Varkan. He said less now. He looked longer at the burned door frames and the empty granaries, as though counting a debt that grew heavier the farther they traveled. In one village, an old woman recognized him despite the black cloak. Her husband had died the night the coup began. She planted herself between Cassian and the village well, as though her body alone could hold back whatever he had come to take. "You want your throne back," she said. "But when they took it from you, who stayed here to save us?" Cassian had nothing to offer her but silence. His officers urged him to keep the company moving. Their food would not stretch to Ravenshade if they lingered. Alara insisted they help the village first. It had been picked clean by mercenaries and left with nothing to plant and nothing to eat. "A king cannot save every person along the road," Cassian said more out of habit than conviction. Alara stepped closer, refusing to let the sentence stand unanswered. "Then what is a kingdom for if not every person living inside it?" He looked past her at the children watching them, from the ruined doorways, thin face silent, in the way children become when they have learned that silence is safer than hope. He ordered the company to unload what food they could spare and redirected the march to break the mercenary blockade choking the village's last road to trade. It was a decision that could have starved his own company before they reached Ravenshade. The village survived instead, and the story of it moved faster than their horses could carry them. More villagers began falling into step behind the column, not for a crown they did not trust, but because they had watched a man with nothing left to prove sacrifice his own advantage for people who owed him nothing. Alara began to see in pieces she was not yet ready to trust completely that Cassian was not simply trying to take his kingdom back. He was trying to become someone different from the king who had lost it in the first place. That did not erase the distance between them. He still spoke in commands more often than requests, and she still challenged him every time he treated the people around him like pieces on a war map instead of lives. Varkon moved between the two of them on the road, answering Alara's touch without. Rowan had not spent 7 years hiding. He had spent them gathering displaced families who had lost everything to the Regency warriors, who still kept the old royal sigil sewn into the linings of their coats, minor alphas from smaller clans who had refused one by one to kneel to a throne built on another man's blood. When Varkon reached the ridge above the valley and threw his head back, the roar that rolled across the mountains was not simply an animal sound. Old swords trembled in hidden chests, silver emblems packed away, and forgotten began to glow faintly under floorboards across 3 provinces. Exiled warriors who had told themselves for years that the old kingdom was dead opened their eyes in the middle of the night and knew without being told that it was not. Not everyone in Rowan's camp welcomed what had arrived alongside Cassian. Several of the older commanders watched Alara with open suspicion. They accused her of enchanting Varkon, of positioning herself to control Cassian through the beast rather than earning any place at his side honestly. One captain went further, calling her a possible council spy, using the old prophecy as a weapon to worm her way into the last loyal camp in Erendor. Rowan defended her, but even he wanted proof, some sign that she did not intend to end up seated beside the throne she claimed not to want. "I do not want the throne," Alara told them, standing in the middle of the circle they had made around her without meaning to look cornered. "But I will not disappear simply to make powerful men feel safe." The argument never resolved because before Rowan could answer, her black-cloaked mercenaries closed around the valley from 3 directions at once. Their masked commander rode forward alone and offered terms with the flat calm of a man who already believed he had won. "Surrender Alara. Chain Varkon. Let Cassian live out his days in exile if he renounced every claim to the crown in writing." Cassian refused before the man finished speaking. The fighting that followed tore through the gorge in a way that told Cassian, even in the middle of it, that something was deeply wrong. The masked commander seemed to know Rowan's signal calls before they were given. He knew the hidden passage the Loyalists used to flank an enemy line. He knew with unsettling precision exactly where Varkon's guard dropped during a turn, and he used that knowledge to bait Cassian into reckless charges again and again, the way only someone who had trained beside him for years could have managed. Cassian broke through the man's guard in the final exchange and struck the silver mask hard enough to shatter one side of it. What fell away beneath the metal was not a stranger's face. It was Darian. His younger brother, believed murdered beside their father on the night of the coup, stood in the mud of the gorge, in Valor's colors, breathing hard, staring not at Cassian but past him at Alara. "You do not know why the beast chose you," Darian said. "When you learn the truth, you will be the one who ends his bloodline." He gave the order to retreat before Cassian could answer, before Cassian could even fully close the distance between them, and the mercenaries pulled back through the tree line as quickly as they had come. Cassian stood frozen in the wreckage of the fight, staring at the space where his brother had disappeared, understanding for the first time the full shape of what Valor had actually stolen from him 7 years ago. Not only a throne, a brother remade into a weapon and pointed at everyone Cassian had left. Rowan called for the wounded to be gathered and the dead to be counted, and still Cassian did not move. Alara found him standing over a discarded strip of the silver mask, turning it slowly in his hands, as though the metal itself might explain how a boy he had taught to hold a sword had become a man who fought beside the people who murdered their father. She did not offer him comfort. She had learned enough of him by now to know he would not have taken it, and instead she simply stayed within arm's reach until his breathing slowed and he set the broken mask down in the mud. "He was 12 the last time I saw him," Cassian said to no one in particular. "He used to follow me into the training yard and copy every stance a half-second too late." He did not say anything else about it that night, but he did not send anyone away when they gathered close to the fire either, and Alara noticed that for the first time since the battlefield, he let Rowan's men sit near enough to hear him think out loud. That night in the quiet after the battle, the silver symbols beneath Varkon's fur had spread further than Alara had ever seen them, threading up his shoulders like binds of old metal catching firelight. She understood, kneeling beside him with the same cloth she had carried since the first battlefield, that the blood she had been washing from him was never only the blood of that single fight. Varkon had carried the blood of betrayers across generations, broken oaths. The memory of kings who had used him as a weapon and discarded him once the war was won, a curse handed down from the very first dynasty to sit the throne of Arendor. Every time he fought for a king who did not deserve him, the curse dug in deeper. That was why he had never allowed anyone to wash it away. To touch that blood was to face every betrayal he had ever carried, and nearly everyone who had tried before her had died of the terror alone. Alara had lived because she had come to him without ambition, without fear, without any desire to own or control what she found. The reason ran deeper than her intentions, though. It ran into her blood itself. Her family had descended from the Keepers of the Oath, a line that had never ruled Varkon, only healed him, and judged generation after generation whether the king he served still deserved to be served. Later, Alpha Kings had erased the Keepers from every record they could reach, unwilling to let their authority answer to anyone. As she worked the cloth along his shoulder, the mark on her palm opened, and Varkon's memory rose to meet her, like water closing over her head. She saw Cassian's father speaking in low private tones with Malgrim years before the coup. She saw Valor at a council table she did not recognize, laying plans with men who wore the Regency's colors before the Regency had a name. She saw Darian taken alive in the chaos of that first night, dragged away rather than killed, though the official histories all claimed he had died beside his father. She saw Cassian younger and certain of himself, waving off a warning from an old advisor because a crowned king did not need to listen to men without titles. And beneath all of it she saw a door sealed and ancient, hidden somewhere, deep inside a mountain she did not recognize. Each image came and went faster than she could hold on to it, one bleeding into the next, the way a fever dream layers rooms that do not belong together. And by the time it slowed enough for her to breathe again, her knees had already given out beneath her in the dirt beside Varkon's flank. Cassian caught her before she fell fully, though he barely registered his own hands moving. She was still somewhere inside the memory, still watching a version of the palace that no longer existed, and it took her several long breaths to remember which century she belonged to. In the last and clearest memory, she heard Cassian's father speak to Malgrim directly, his voice steady with a decision already made. "If the throne must fall so my son can learn that power is not inheritance," the old king said, "then I will let it fall." He had seen what his son could not yet see, that the dynasty was rotting from the inside, and that handing Cassian an intact throne would only produce another ruler who mistook bloodline for worth. He had chosen not to stop the first stage of the coup. He had meant for the fall to expose the traitors hiding inside his own court, and to drive his son toward an old trial the family had kept buried for generations. If Cassian relied only on the crown he was born to, he would die in exile unmourned. If he learned instead to protect the people beneath him, Varkon would recognize him again on his own terms. And if he proved unworthy of either, the throne would simply belong to someone who was. What the king-father had not accounted for was Valor's appetite. The careful removal he had planned had turned into slaughter war and 7 years of suffering for people who had never. Malgrim told them the fortress would open for no one who still treated the throne as something to be owned. That was the whole of the trial, stripped of its old ceremony, not a bloodline test, not a contest of strength, but a question of what a man reached for first when everything he wanted was finally within his grasp. The question stopped being theoretical by morning. Cassian had 3 roads in front of him, and every scout and commander in Rowan's camp seemed to favor a different one. He could march straight on the capital and let Varkon's presence alone break the city's will to fight. He could hand Alara to the council in exchange for the noble houses still weighing which side to join. Or he could turn the army away from the capital entirely and spend it instead on freeing the thousands of civilians Valor was holding as living shields along the southern road, a choice that would cost them the momentum Varkon's roar had just bought them, and possibly the war itself. Every military advantage pointed toward striking now. The army was assembled. The enemy was still reeling from the ambush. Rowan and his commanders argued not unreasonably that this window would not open twice. Alara did not argue tactics. She only said the one thing none of the commanders had thought to say. "You lost the throne because you believed the kingdom belonged to you," she told Cassian, in front of Rowan, in front of all of them. "This is the moment to prove that you belong to the kingdom." Cassian gave the order within the hour. Every available soldier would move to free the captured civilians. The assault on the capital would wait. It was a decision that visibly shook men who had spent 7 years dreaming of exactly this chance to strike, and Cassian did not soften it for them. He led the rescue himself, pulling villagers out of cage lines and shield formations, breaking mercenary positions through discipline and numbers rather than turning Varkon loose as a weapon of terror. When the last prisoners were free, Varkon crossed the field to him and lowered his head the first time in 7 years he had done so for Cassian. Cassian did not reach for him immediately. He waited, hands at his sides, until Varkon closed the last of the distance on his own, because he had learned finally that anything worth having had to be chosen rather than claimed. The rescue had cost them more than momentum. It had been a diversion. While the army's attention was fixed on the shield lines, Darian's men moved on the medical wagons at the rear of the column and seized Alara before anyone realized she was gone. She fought. She got one man across the face with the same wooden bucket she had carried since the first battlefield, but a second bound her wrists before she could reach a blade. And by the time Varkon caught her scent again, Darian was already carrying her north toward the capital. Cassian found the torn strip of cloth that had hidden her mark lying in the mud near the wagons, and understood, holding it exactly how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. Malgrim caught up to him moments later with the only comfort he had to offer, which was not much of one. Valor would not kill her quickly. He needed her alive and public to make Varkon bow before the whole capital and prove the throne was his by more than force. Cassian wanted to ride for the capital that night with whatever men would follow him. Rowan put a hand on his chest and stopped him before he reached his horse. "If you become the king you were, before you will lose her before you reach the gate," Rowan said. It was not gentle, and it was not meant to be. Cassian had spent 7 years learning to lead with patience he had not possessed as a young king, and the old general was not going to watch him throw that away in a single reckless night. Cassian forced himself to trust the army and the plan, instead of the fear clawing up his throat, though it cost him something to do it. In the capital, Valor had Alara chained inside the throne room that had once belonged to Cassian's family. He circled her once unhurried, a man already tasting a victory he considered finished. "You will touch the beast before the whole city," he told her. "You will make him bow to me. Then the prophecy will belong to the man who actually controls it." "A beast that chooses cannot be owned," Alara said. Valor smiled at that, the way a man smiles at a child who has not yet learned how the world actually works. "Everything can be owned," he said, "when enough pain is applied." Darian watched the exchange from the doorway, saying nothing. Valor had kept him alive after the coup for exactly this kind of use, shaping him for 7 years into a weapon aimed wherever Valor pointed, and Darian had let himself believe, because it was easier than the alternative, that his own brother had simply fled and left him to whatever the rebels intended. Alara looked at him across the chained length of the room and said the thing no one else had bothered to say to him in 7 years. "You do not serve Valor because you believe in him," she said. "You serve him because you want Cassian to feel the same abandonment you felt." Darian did not answer her. But something in his certainty, built carefully over 7 years to keep him from asking questions he could not survive the answers to, cracked for the first time since the coup. Valor gave no sign of noticing. He had already moved on to the final preparations, silver chains forged specifically to bind a creature that had never once been fully bound, and the blood of warriors killed for exactly this purpose gathered to call Varkon into the capital, whether Varkon intended to come or not. The curse answered the summons before Varkon did. It tore through him. The moment the blood touched the chains, and he came through the outer gate like something the city had only ever heard about in old songs, striking at Valor's soldiers and Cassian's advancing forces with no distinction between them at all. Cassian still carried the royal seal that could force Varkon's obedience by right of bloodline, a single command that might win the battle outright and kill Varkon under the weight of the curse in the process. Cassian stood between both armies, raised the seal where every soldier on the field could see it, and broke it against the stones at his feet. "You are not my weapon," he said. "You never belonged to me." The seal's destruction tore something loose in the curse binding Varkon to generations of kings who had used him exactly that way, and it cost Cassian the single greatest advantage he had left in the war. He made the trade without hesitating because he had finally understood what his father had spent a throne trying to teach him. Inside the palace, Darian used the chaos to do the one thing he could not undo the rest with. He cut Alara's chains himself, said nothing to explain it, and let her run before Valor's guards noticed she was free. She reached the central square already burning with the sound of a city tearing itself apart. Varkon's fur had caught fire with centuries of blood, the red judgment consuming him past anything she had witnessed on the first battlefield, and she understood, walking toward him through the rain that had just begun to fall, that touching him now could pour the entire curse into her own body instead of his. She walked into the square anyway. She wrapped both arms around his neck the way she had the very first time, before either of them knew what the gesture would cost. "You carried it long enough," she said. She used the rain and the same worn cloth that had never quite come clean since that first afternoon, and the blood began to run from his fur in the water pooling around her knees. The memories came for her harder this time. Broken kings murdered soldiers, whole clans betrayed across generations, and her knees buckled under the weight of carrying what had never been hers to carry. She stayed on her feet anyway, or close enough to it, until the last of the blood washed clean. Cassian fought his way across the square to reach her, while Valor's remaining soldiers tried to hold the ground between them. Darian turned on the men he had served for 7 years and held the palace steps alone, rather than let anyone reach her first. When the final trace of blood disappeared from Varkon's fur, Alara collapsed into the flooded stones, and Varkon released a sound that was not a roar at all, but something closer to grief finally allowed to surface. The ground beneath the capital began to shake. Stones split somewhere in the mountain behind the city, and the fortress that had waited generations for this exact moment began. The mountain opened onto a fortress of black stone that had waited so long for this moment that dust had settled into the shape of the door itself. The old stories, half forgotten even by Malgrim, had always insisted the gates answered to 3 conditions and nothing else the beast freed from royal ownership. The blood of betrayal cleansed by a keeper of the oath, and a king who had chosen his people over his own crown. Cassian, Alara, and Varkon had met all 3 without ever intending to pass a test none of them had known they were taking. Malgrim admitted, climbing the last of the broken stairs behind them, that he had walked this same passage once, as a young advisor sent by Cassian's grandfather to see whether the old stories were even true. The gate had not opened for him. He had assumed for 40 years that the trial itself was a myth, invented to comfort a dynasty that had already lost the right to be tested. Standing in the doorway now, watching the stone yield to 3 people who had never once discussed a plan to earn it, he understood that the myth had simply been waiting for someone willing to fail every advantage it offered. Inside, on a plain stone plinth, waited a sword without jewels, without a royal crest, without anything to mark it as belonging to any bloodline at all. Malgrim, following behind them into the dark, explained what little he remembered of it. The blade held its power only for a hand that meant to protect something, never for a hand that meant to conquer. Cassian lifted it anyway, unsure, until the moment his fingers closed around the hilt whether it would answer him at all. "I did not return to reclaim what belongs to me," he said, loud enough to carry back through the open gate to the soldiers gathered below. "I returned to give the kingdom back to those who were forced to live in fear of it." The sword caught what little light reached it, and held the glow long after it should have faded. Outside, Valor was still shouting orders. No one obeyed anymore. He commanded his soldiers to kill Cassian where he stood, and one by one, starting with the men closest to the square who had watched Cassian abandon the capital's throne to save civilians, and watched Alara nearly die washing a curse out of a dying beast, weapons lowered into the mud. His own commanders peeled away from him without a word. Valor turned on Alara instead. Blade raised, the last move left to a man who had built his entire life on the idea that fear always worked eventually. Darian reached her first. He took the blade meant for her across his own side and went down hard in the flooded stone, and it was the closest thing to an apology he had left to offer either of them. Cassian disarmed Valor before he could strike again. He could have ended it there, and every soldier watching would have understood if he had. His hand tightened once around the hilt he had only just claimed, and for the length of a single breath the square went silent enough to hear the rain hitting stone. Then he lowered the sword. He ordered Valor bound and handed over to be judged by the clan leaders and the people he had ruled through tribute and fear for 7 years, not because mercy came easily to him in that moment, but because he had learned at considerable cost what kind of king used power only to end a life rather than to answer for one. Valor did not go quietly. He twisted against the men who bound him and shouted the same argument he had built his whole reign on, that a kingdom run on kindness would collapse the moment a harder man tested its edges, that Cassian's mercy tonight would cost 1,000 lives tomorrow. Nobody in the square answered him. Nobody needed to. The silence itself was the answer delivered by people who had spent 7 years learning exactly how much a kingdom run on fear actually cost, paid in sons conscripted and grain seized, and names no one had been permitted to speak above a whisper. Valor screamed at his remaining men to fight. Not one of them moved. Varkon crossed the square toward him at last, and for one held breath, the entire capital seemed to wait for the beast to finish what the war had started. Varkon did not attack. He turned his back on Valor instead and walked away. And the gesture landed harder than any blow could have. The final judgment from the one creature Valor had spent years trying to control, delivered simply by refusing to see him at all. Cassian reached the palace steps that led to the throne he had lost 7 years earlier. He did not climb them. He looked instead at Alara, still unconscious in the flooded square, cloth wrapped and unwrapped a dozen times over her marked palm, and said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud. "No crown is worth the life of the person who taught me how to deserve it." Alara survived the night, though it took 2 full days before she opened her eyes again. The silver mark on her palm had changed by then, settled into a new shape, not the old symbol of a hidden bloodline, but something closer to a covenant between a ruler, his people, the beast bound to protect them, and the keeper who judged whether any of it still deserved protecting. Varkon slept curled against her cot the entire time, and for the first time in longer than even he could measure, his sleep carried no war in it at all. The capital opened its gates to Cassian without anyone forcing them open. He refused an immediate coronation. Instead, he summoned every voice the old crown had never bothered to hear, representatives of the wolf clans, common villagers, families. The war had scattered soldiers who had never broken their oath and leaders who had stayed neutral rather than choose a side they didn't trust. In front of all of them, he declared that the throne of Arendor would no longer pass through blood alone. Every Alpha King after him would need recognition from the people, from the clan council, from a keeper of the oath, and from the beast itself, exactly the way it should have worked all along, before generations of kings had quietly erased the parts of the system that held them accountable. Rowan returned to serve as commander with the standing right to tell his king when he was wrong, a right Cassian insisted on writing into law himself. He told the old general in front of the same clan leaders who would ratify it that a kingdom that punished honesty in its own commanders was simply the old throne wearing a new face, and he would not build his reign on that same rot twice. Darian survived his wound and was given the chance to atone the only way that meant anything to him. Years spent rebuilding the lands the mercenaries had stripped bare, while he wore Valor's mask. He asked for no pardon, and Cassian offered none outright, only the work itself. And the 2 brothers spoke for the first time in 7 years, the night before Darian left for the southern villages, neither of them pretending the conversation closed a wound that would take longer than a single night to close. Malgrim confessed the whole of his role in the old king's plan before the assembled clans, and stepped down from any position of influence, choosing instead to spend what years he had left preserving the true history he had helped bury. Valor faced judgment from the villages he had taxed into starvation, and the families whose sons he had conscripted, and Cassian did not interfere with what they decided. When it came time to decide what Alara herself should receive, Cassian did not simply hand her a title because Varkon had chosen her before he did. He asked her what she wanted. She asked for a sanctuary where wounded people and wounded creatures could be healed without fear of what they were, for the restoration of the keepers of the oath to the kingdom's true history, and for laws that would make it far harder for any future king to erase the voice of his own people again. Cassian agreed to all of it, and something settled between them that had nothing left to do with servant and king. They had become instead two people who had chosen to guard the same oath for reasons that belonged only to themselves. On the palace balcony that evening, Cassian stood beside her while Varkon lay behind them, his black fur finally completely free of blood. Below, no one knelt. The people simply stood and said his name the way people say a name they have decided on their own to trust again. Alara stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. It was Cassian who broke the silence quietly enough that it was meant only for her. 7 years ago I would have called this moment a victory, he said. I do not think I would have known what that word actually meant. Alara did not answer with words. She simply reached down and rested her marked palm against Varkon's flank, and the beast exhaled the way something exhales when it has finally set down a weight it carried for longer than anyone still living could remember. Cassian took the crown from his own head and looked out over the kingdom he had spent 7 years learning how to deserve. A true king is not made by the throne he manages to reclaim. He is made in the single moment he chooses to protect one life, even knowing it might cost him everything he has left. Sometimes the first one to recognize a true king is not a council or an army or the weight of an old bloodline. Sometimes it is a creature that has carried too much blood for too long until one steady, unafraid hand finally proves brave enough to wash it clean. A true king is not created by the throne he inherits. He is recognized through the lives he chooses to protect. And loyalty that grows from that kind of choosing will always outlast the kind that fear tries to buy. If a story like this one found you tonight, there is another waiting whenever you are ready for it.